Good morning. Oh, very good. Whoa, you're awake. I want to thank you for coming this morning. Some of you were here yesterday afternoon at the Senate meeting, which was a very productive meeting, and I was very appreciative of the good work that the faculty are doing. They have really come up with a good process to help us get things moved through for these new academic programs, and as a result, we're really starting to cook on that, which is nice. Every year, a firm called Modern Think does something called the Great Colleges to Work For. And they ask a series of questions to people on campuses, and then based on that, they kind of let you know what you do well, what your opportunities for improvement are, and then some other things that might be helpful to you. We did this survey 4 years ago. I think it was, I think as a result, the HR office said, you know, this is a good thing for us to do. Then last year, but when we did it 4 years ago, we only did a subset of the campus. We said, oh, you know what, we'll just take 300 people. And we got a good number. It was statistically significant. But we felt like this time we wanted to survey everybody. So this particular round, we have surveyed everybody on the campus. There was a good response rate, which was great. And so what I have asked Great Colleges to Work For, Modern Think, Richard Boyer, to come here and explain what the results of our survey are. And what will come out of this? You'll see, because he has some, like I said, you're doing this well. These are some of your opportunities for improvement. What will come out of this are some task forces that will help us come up with some concrete things so that we can move on some of these markers. I will tell you that 4 years ago, one of the things that came out of our survey was that we wish we had a program that recognized good work. And because of that, the STARS program was born, which was fantastic. So that's grown, and I'm appreciative of the foundation for the work that they do in supporting that every year, because it's a way to bring all the campus together, because we all work really hard to make sure that we are providing a first-class education for our students and that we're serving each other well. So without further ado, Richard, it's your show. Oh, before I go any further, I want to thank the HR office and Natalie, as well as the Institutional Effectiveness Office, for joining together and making this possible. So, thank you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here with you all this morning, particularly given that I drove up from Wilmington, Delaware, and the Turnpike was a harrowing experience, as I'm sure many of y'all's commute was this morning. We've got a pretty robust data set here, and my intent here today is to provide a high-level overview. So we did ask a number of different demographic questions, so we can disaggregate this data set in all sorts of meaningful ways. And, that's a little bit beyond the time we've got allotted for today. But what I intend to do is provide essentially an abbreviated SWOT analysis, sharing with you what our perspective is as we look at the responses to the faculty and staff on this particular survey. Just by way of background and context, just by a show of hands, how many folks are familiar with the Great Colleges to Work For program? Okay, thanks. So folks who know Modern Think generally know about us through our work through that program. We launched that program in 2007 in partnership with the Chronicle. I was just sharing with your provost that Coupa HR, the current president, Andy Brantley, had a hand in making that connection for that program. It was and has been exceptionally well received. Every spring we survey about 300 colleges and universities across the country. Our database today includes over 1,400 unique colleges and universities. If you take the for-profits out of the equation, there's about 4,700 colleges in this country today. So that gives you some insight in terms of our benchmarking, gives you some insight in terms of the lens through which I'll be looking at your data and sharing kind of my analysis. We'll definitely carve out some time for questions, so please don't hesitate. One of the things that surfaced in this survey was that faculty and staff both were eager for more of a culture of communication. I'll talk more about that, what I mean by that. But folks were eager for more communication from and with senior leadership and eager for greater confidence in a sense of transparency. All right? And my intention here to be is as transparent as I possibly can with these survey results. Nobody has told me what I can or can't say, so I will share with you my unfiltered analysis. I want to talk a little bit just about kind of the survey. I don't want to jump right into results. I want to provide a little bit of context. When we think about workplace quality, organization culture, human capital, if we were to look at kind of an industry or sector analysis, higher ed is a little late coming to the party. Right? Prior to my work at Modern Think, I worked for an organization called the Great Place to Work Institute. That's the organization that does the research for Fortune magazine's annual list, the 100 best companies to work for. We don't see a lot of colleges and universities participate in those kinds of programs. So we are seeing this gap close. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more colleges and universities be thoughtful, intentional, and strategic around workplace quality. So by way of example, it's unusual for me today to see a college or university strategic plan that doesn't have goals or initiatives related to the ability to attract and retain world-class faculty or staff, or the ability to attract and retain diverse faculty and staff, or the ability to create a culture of innovation so we can navigate this new normal post-recession that everybody's been dealing with, where we're challenged for resources in ways that we really hadn't been before and continue to struggle with. So we're seeing more of it. We're also seeing more interest from leadership. And by way of example, any client that I share with you, I have permission to speak about. But one example of that, not just from boards, but even from state legislatures, we're now doing a project with the University of North Carolina system, the 17 public institutions in that system. That was a function of the legislature saying, we want you to capture metrics regarding your human capital experience. So that's a 5-year project. We'll be doing surveys every 2 years. So we're seeing more and more of this. So, this data gives us insight into how healthy your culture is, and it has a lot of potential use other than just how happy our faculty and staff are, whether it be informing a strategic plan or informing self-studies regarding the accreditors and what things they're looking at. Most of these statements, many of these statements, I should say, we can map to the standards and criteria that accreditors are interested in looking at. So there's potentially a lot of linkages. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about those. I want to give you just a brief overview of the survey instrument so you have a sense of what we're doing. This is an instrument we've spent a lot of time developing. We convene a blue ribbon panel every 3 years from experts across higher ed to weigh in both on the instrument as well as the methodology we use in the Great Colleges to Work For program. We'll then go into my analysis, our analysis, again using kind of an abbreviated SWOT filter. We'll talk about some of the key findings. I'll share with you some of what we think are your high leverage opportunities, recommendations. And then, of course, we'll have some questions, times for questions and answers. So I mentioned strategic linkages. So what are some of those? I've alluded to a couple of them: strategic planning, accreditation, board transition, board mandate. We're seeing boards being much more thoughtful in terms of their oversight responsibilities, making sure that your leaders, your cabinet, are being good stewards not just of financial resources, but of human resources. Increasingly, we're also seeing surveys like this used when there's leadership transition. The first time I saw this was a number of years ago. We had a new provost there was a new provost at this institution who was following on the heels of a provost who was not well liked or well regarded. And this new provost felt very strongly about trying to get some sort of assessment of what he was inheriting. And he wanted to essentially say, this is what I own moving forward. I'm not responsible for these results today, but I'm responsible for them moving forward. He felt so strongly about that he wanted to negotiate into his employment contract. He ultimately didn't have to do that. But that was the first time I saw that. That was probably 8 years ago, and we're seeing more and more of that kind of interest in a survey like this at leadership transition, whether it be a president, a provost, a chancellor, or what have you. When an institution has mission, vision, values, when you have an articulated set of values, it's often useful to see how are we doing as a community in terms of living those values, right? And so many of these standards, these items that we ask in the survey, map to some of the more commonly found values that we see at colleges and universities. Obviously a hot topic, not just today, but for many years, and will continue to be, are colleges and universities focusing on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, inclusive excellence. When there is that kind of work, this survey can certainly be helpful towards that end. This is not intended to be a climate survey in terms of a diversity, equity, inclusion survey, which we're seeing more and more of these days. Having said that, because we do ask statements and we can disaggregate the findings by protected class, and there are a handful of statements that are certainly related to very specific dynamics regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, it does give us some insight into that. So lots of potential applications for this kind of survey data. All right, let's talk about the survey instrument itself. So this was an online survey. It was administered back February 12th through March 9th. Our first data point that we'll talk about here, you'll see under the response rate, we had 394 of 917 who were invited to participate. We had a 43% response rate. Let me share some context with you. So your last survey with the Great Colleges to Work For program was 2013. And that was a much smaller sample that we had there. Generally, we don't like to go back and do kind of year-to-year comparison when you're at 5 years. You all are a very different institution today than you were 5 years ago. You've got a new baseline moving forward. You've had significant leadership transition. You'll have more transition in the not-too-distant future. So we're going to call this essentially a new baseline. That 43% response rate falls pretty much in line with what we would expect given your survey history. So by way of comparison, in the Great Colleges to Work For program, response rates generally range between 36 and 46%. We see a little bit lower response among faculty on those. And when we're working with institutions outside of the context of the program, or when we have a longer runway prior to deploying the survey and we can be more thoughtful in terms of accompanying communication plan, it is not uncommon for us to get response rates at the 67 or even 80% level. Given you don't have a long and robust history of doing surveys like this, though you've done other surveys, I'm not surprised by the 43%, and the reality is we've still got a pretty good data set, certainly when we look at it in its entirety. When we look at the confidence intervals and the margins of error on this, we can operate with a high degree of confidence that this data set is in fact reflective of the population as a whole when we're, again, looking at the data set in its highest. Okay, so the little box here talks a little bit about the composition of the survey. So there's 60 belief statements. So we ask a statement, we ask you to respond to it on a 5-point agreement scale. There is a not applicable, it's very infrequently selected. We're going to spend most of our time talking about the belief statements. There were additional statements that you all asked, 10 additional statements, and we'll tease those out as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the benefit satisfaction, but that's an important item and important data, particularly for your HR team, to look at kind of the benefits in terms of what you all are most satisfied with and where those opportunities are. There were 2 open-ended questions, and I can share with you a couple of things. One, folks are a lot of things at this university, but disengaged is not one of them. We had a lot of responses to those open-ended questions, and I will share with you some of the themes that surfaced in those. There were 13 demographic questions, as I mentioned, protected class, as well as a number of others, allowing us to disaggregate the data set in all sorts of meaningful ways. We've got some benchmark capabilities. So among the things we'll be looking at is how do you all compare today to other institutions that share your Carnegie classification. We've got an aspirational benchmark is what I would characterize the honor roll benchmark. We're not going to do a lot with that today. That's the best institutions that we can find today. For those who aren't familiar with the Great Colleges to Work For program, there are 12 recognition categories. So you could be recognized, for example, in the experience of shared governance, or the supervisory managerial effectiveness of those in supervisory roles, or the sense of connection to and confidence in senior leadership. So 12 different recognition categories. Any participating institution could be recognized in one or potentially multiple categories. Those institutions that are recognized in the most number of categories every year achieve a special distinction that we call the honor roll. To be recognized in the honor roll in 2018, you had to be recognized in 7 categories or more. It's our attempt to find essentially the best workplaces we can in higher ed. So again, kind of an aspirational benchmark. So we talked about the response rate overall. Here we're breaking down response rate by job category. Just gives you some sense, and frankly, this is pretty typical. I was sharing with your provost earlier that we generally do see a little bit lower response rate among faculty. And in highly unionized workforces, it's not uncommon to have lower response rates in our non-exempt staff. So given this is our first survey like this in quite some time, frankly, I'm pleased with your 43% response rate. All right, let's transition a little bit. So we're going to do some analysis on items, individual items. So we're going to do a version of what we call top box analysis. So what we're going to do, you'll see here at the top of this slide, the response options. I mentioned it was a 5-point agreement scale and a not applicable. So in this version of top box, it's essentially a top 2 box. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine the strongly agree and the agree response options and characterize that as a positive response. We're going to do the same thing on the opposite of the response continuum with the negative response, the strongly disagree and the disagree. This is intended as a rule of thumb, as a guide to facilitate our understanding and making meaning of this data set at a high level. So again, this is intended as a guide, but for the most part, when you see a positive response at the 75% level or above, we would consider that exceptional. That's where most of the benchmarks are for our honor roll institutions. When you have aspirational goals around being an employer of choice or having high levels of faculty staff engagement, when you see positive response below 55%, that suggests that there are some areas that we need to focus on. And we've got a number of items which we're going to be at that level. The negative response, I think it is important to note, we expect to see negative response on every one of those items, right? So even at the very best workplaces we can find in higher ed, there's still a small percentage of the population who are committed to being miserable, right? Even at the very best workplaces. I start to get curious when I see negative response at the 15% level or higher, and certainly when I see the 20%. If we get a negative response at 20%, essentially what that translates to is we have 1 in 5 of our community members who are experiencing some organizational dynamic or some leadership competency, the exact opposite of how we would want them to. So negative response at the 20% level or higher should get our attention. We use a couple terms. So let's, just in the abundance of clarity, let's define a couple terms that show up on the survey. So when you see institution, refers to the entire university. Most notable here is the senior leadership dimension, refers to the president and her direct reports. And then you'll see the supervisor department chair, essentially referring to the individual whom you directly report. Let's talk just for a second about the instrument itself. So, for all practical purposes, this is what would be called a faculty staff engagement survey. Now, there's an issue with this construct of engagement. Employee engagement essentially is an evolution of the construct of employee satisfaction, which has its roots in some of the early academic work on the construct of organizational citizenship. Having said that, there's no one generally accepted definition of what engagement is, right? Now, there is a lot of overlap, a lot of consistency in some of the research on those things that impact or influence an engaged workforce, and those are the kinds of things that we're asking about. So what we're looking at now are what we call the 15 core dimensions. These are the major themes which we group the statements by. It's not an accident of chance. When we do our factor analysis, these are largely how they break out. We take a little bit of poetic license in a couple of the groupings just to make them more accessible to folks who don't do survey research on a regular basis. So these are the 15 major dimensions of which we're asking about. So the next 3 slides, what we're going to look at are the overall positive response across these dimensions, and we're going to compare them to that Carnegie benchmark I mentioned earlier. So institutions in our database who share your same Carnegie classification, and these would be institutions who we surveyed in 2018. Okay, so again, just in the abundance of clarity, let me define this slide a little bit more. So the supervisor department chairs here, you see. So there are 7 items on the survey that give us insight into the experience of one's immediate supervisor. So what we're looking at here is the positive response, the percent positive response on those 7 items that comprise that dimension. Similarly, when we look at the other dimensions here, we're looking at the positive response of the items that comprise that dimension. So you'll see, 67% positive, that's pretty good in terms of our supervisors department chairs, and I would characterize that as a relative strength today. We're going to do, when we segue into our SWOT analysis, we'll talk about some of those strengths, and certainly one of those is the sense of pride. Tremendous sense of pride among faculty and staff in terms of the work you're doing, the impact you're having on students, and the impact in the community as a whole. In terms of job satisfaction and support, there's another pretty good finding here as it relates to the sense of autonomy that faculty and staff have, kind of the antithesis of being micromanaged. We'll look at a very specific item related to that. I do want to dispel the myth regarding the 4th bullet here, the 4th column rather, that I think oftentimes there's a misperception that being a great workplace is all about comp and benefits. And I have been doing this research for the last 20 years, both in higher ed as well as elsewhere. And I can tell you I've seen a lot of organizations over the years where people are paid really well and they're really miserable, right? You can't simply buy your way into being a great workplace. Having said that, there does need to be some foundational level of perceived fairness regarding compensation. Fairness as it relates to the external market, fairness as it relates to the internal system itself. So we'll talk a little bit more. We'll tease that out. We'll look at benefits and work-life balance. Professional development, most of the research on engagement, this is considered a pretty significant driver of an engaged workforce, the belief that there's opportunities to learn and grow, to expand your skill set. Related but different to that is the ability or the belief that there's opportunity to advance within the institution. We'll look at a couple items related to that. Second of our three statements in this progression, we'll talk about facilities, because when there are issues regarding compensation and or facilities, that can not just impact our ability to do work, but for many it's also perceived as a fairness issue. How can you expect me to perform at this level if we don't have the resources or the facilities we need? So we'll tease that out a little bit as well. Respect and appreciation. This is something that as a whole, higher ed, it puzzles me in some regards. On one hand it puzzles me, on the other it doesn't. But I can pretty much guarantee that I can go to any college or university campus today, and when I look at what they do systemically to create a culture of recognition or a culture of appreciation, I'm going to see the years of service awards, right? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years of service, maybe an associated luncheon, and if it's a progressive institution, I might get to pick my own tchotchke out of the catalog for the prize that I get or the gift that I get. So I pretty much can guarantee you I'm going to see that. Often we'll see a handful of distinguished faculty or distinguished teaching awards, right? And again, if it's a progressive institution, we may see the equivalent of distinguished service awards for those on the staff side of the house. But beyond that, frankly, we're not seeing a whole lot. I was heartened to see that you all actually did take some of the feedback from the last survey and implemented the STARS program. This is an area where colleges and universities today across the country still are kind of struggling with. We've not necessarily figured that out. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. In terms of on this, we're going to see 2 on this slide here of a progression, and there's a hierarchy for me when I think of communication, collaboration, and shared governance, right? So the quality of our collaboration is influenced by the quality of our communication. I've yet to see a high-performing team or a high-performing institution or organization that works really well together that fundamentally doesn't communicate well. Right? So there's a hierarchy there. And within higher ed, we have a very specific form of collaboration called shared governance. Right? Like engagement, there is no one dictionary definition for shared governance. I have seen literally hundreds of shared governance models over the years. So shared governance, I think, is easy to talk about in the abstract, right? Who's not for shared governance? And there's a lot more to it than that. And again, we'll tease that out in a little bit more detail as well. Third of our slides here, and you'll note that you keen observers, that we're going here into essentially decreasing order in terms of our positive response. So shared governance you'll see in the middle of this. So I'm not surprised by this given what we just saw in the communication and the collaboration. And it's related to faculty administration and staff relations. When they do the factor analysis, they do shake out separately, but they're very much closely related. Senior leadership. And for those who may not be aware, I was here, gosh, I want to say 3 weeks ago. The date eludes me right now, where I did an initial findings presentation to the cabinet. And I will share with you, I found them to be very open to the data and very committed to working with it. Oftentimes when results come back, particularly some of the items that we see here, that particularly among senior leadership, we'll see something that we in the survey business call data denial, right? We look to dismiss the data. We don't like the instrument. We don't like the timing of the survey. We don't like that consultant, Rich Boyer, right? Anything we can to dismiss the data. The reality is, with the response rate we have, we've got a data set. I have no concerns regarding the validity or reliability of this data set. And I will share with you, I found your cabinet very open to this and very interested in using the data to help the good work that you all are trying to do. Okay, so let's now move into some statements here. So let me describe, we're going to see a few statements that look like this. So the number on the left here is the number of the item in the sequence of the survey. Then we've got the item itself. Then we've got 4 columns of data. We've got the positive and the negative for NJCU, and then we've got the positive and negative for the overall, so the Carnegie classification rather, just to provide some context. So these are what we would call barometer statements. And in our definition of a barometer statement, it's an item where there may not be anything that's specifically actionable in it, but it nonetheless gives us insight into a dynamic that we know is important. So there is a saying, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Tip O'Neill is credited with it, former Speaker of the House, all politics are local. And my variation of that is all great workplaces start at the local level, right? So item 25 gives us some insight into that. If folks aren't excited or plugged in or engaged at the department or work group level, it is highly unlikely they're going to experience the organization as a great place to work. So we've actually got a pretty good finding on that. 70% positive, 10% negative, compares certainly favorably with our Carnegie classification. I mentioned earlier that there was a strong sense of pride at the institution, and at 67 and 8, it's not the highest scoring item, but it is a pretty solid finding today. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Item number 59 and 60 are interesting, and at our best places to work, the very best places to work we can find in higher ed, item 59 is highly predictive of item 60, and which leads us to kind of a conclusion that one of the differentiating qualities of these great workplaces is the perception among faculty and staff that the culture is special, that it's unique, that it's different, that being part of this community, being an employee or being a member of this community is different and better than what my other options might be. There's no question in my mind, as I look at your survey data, as I read your comments, as I spend time getting to know you all as a university, as a community, you've got the makings of a very compelling story, right, in terms of what is special and unique about being part of this institution. You've got the raw material is there, it just hasn't necessarily been woven together. So we'll talk more about that as well. When we expand the frame of reference, similar to item 25 that we ask all things considered, this is a great place to work. At 55 and 18, clearly we're seeing the significant gap between that experience and the experience of the department as a whole. Okay, let's do some headlines here. Right? So I mentioned that I was going to structure this as an abbreviated SWOT analysis. And I will absolutely admit to being an optimist by nature. I don't think I'm Pollyannish by any means, but I think it is important when you're doing analysis on data sets like this that you do spend time looking at those things those areas where you do well, right? Often there's a tendency just to focus on the low scoring items and figure out how do we fix those. That's an important part of your analysis, no question. I would suggest equally important is making sure you've got a good handle on what your strengths are today, because those strengths potentially are the foundational pieces for the common perception of a special and or unique culture. All right, so what are those strengths? Job fit and autonomy. We're going to look at some supporting evidence here on all of these, and connection to mission. Supervisor department chair competencies, given the influence on engagement, this is a particularly important one, and it's good that we've got a good foundation there. Benefits and work-life balance, you do well on. You'll note that compensation isn't part of that, but the benefits and work-life balance, we've got some good results on. And certainly we have some good findings regarding this institution's and this community's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. On the opposite side of the ledger, there is certainly a theme around resource constraints. It manifests in a lot of different ways. And it is rare that I see a college or university today, frankly, post-recession, that isn't struggling regarding resource constraints. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's important to know, not going to suggest that those are things we can easily fix overnight, but there are things that we can do to help mitigate some of the pain as it relates to resource constraints. There's a theme around performance management and accountability, and that also, much like the resource constraints, is informed by a couple different pieces. Everything from the things that we do to create a culture of appreciation, to how well we integrate and onboard our new faculty and staff, to the consistency of our performance review process, and even our ability to have some of the difficult conversations when people aren't performing to standard or when their behavior isn't consistent with the values that we espouse in the community we want to be. We talked earlier, I alluded to this hierarchy, this troika: communication, collaboration, and shared governance. Nobody has a monopoly on feeling like they want more communication or be more involved in conversations and decision making. So we're going to tease that out. And as I alluded to earlier, the shared governance certainly is connected to senior leadership. And one of the things, and we're going to look at a number of different items regarding senior leadership, but faculty and staff are eager for a greater sense of connection to and confidence in senior leadership. And I think that's a message that the cabinet heard very willingly when I was with them a couple weeks ago. We're not going to do a lot of disaggregating the data, but I did want to share with you just a couple. So here what we're looking at is the overall positive results across the 60 core statements. So we had 10 additional belief statements that were custom to NJCU. This is across the 60 core statements. And this actually is all things considered, a pretty good finding. Obviously, we've got you'll see the ends on some of these. When you've got an N of 10, it doesn't take but one or two individuals to make a significant swing on that. All things considered, despite the fact that our faculty are lower, this is pretty consistent. And this is another, I'm not sure I'd call it a trend, but it's another, probably better said, is another differentiating quality of great workplaces. Is that one of the things that we're seeing at these honor roll institutions is there's a consistency of experience across the organization. They're not just great workplaces for tenured faculty or for executive staff or for cabinet members. There's a consistency of experience. So one of the areas we look at is the consistency of the experience across job category. Again, notwithstanding the faculty being lower, all things considered, this is pretty consistent. Similarly, when we look at academic division, we'll look at academic division and department very quickly here. Arts and sciences, it's more common than not these days that colleges of arts and sciences we're seeing lower responses, lower positive responses on surveys of this nature for lots of different reasons, some that make sense and some that may not. In terms of department, and this just again kind of foreshadows the ability to disaggregate the data set. As your president was saying, the intention is to create some task force afterwards here. And task force potentially may tackle thematic areas and support in some form or fashion the continued sharing of the results either by academic division or administrative unit and or department. So again, get a sense of the consistency here. Let me just spend a second on that real quick, just in terms of survey process. So, a survey, on one hand, foundationally, it's an assessment tool, right? It's a diagnostic tool. It gives us insight to the health of a culture at a particular point in time. I would also suggest, though, a survey is a communication tool, right? We've gone to the trouble to ask faculty and staff to tell us what they think, what you all think. It is only good survey practice to play that back to the community. And generally, we start doing that with initial conversations with the president, chancellor, and their leadership team, which we did a couple weeks ago, and then look to essentially share the information throughout the institution. This is our first of 2 town hall meetings we'll do. This is not the only opportunity you will have to see survey data, and I think the intention is to disaggregate the data in meaningful ways, particularly by some of the groups that we've just looked at here. So we're right now in the kind of, we've deployed the survey, we've got the results, we're playing the results back to the community, right? Different from that and subsequent is the action planning phase. And just because I want to help manage expectations. Nobody, if you were to ask cabinet members, and we've got a number of them present here today, what are we going to do about these results? What are we going to do? I think it's a fair question in terms of what the next steps are. And I don't think we want any cabinet member or the cabinet as a whole identifying all the solutions without some sort of more collaborative participatory process. All right, so that's a little bit about the process here. So the next 2 slides, this is my homage to David Letterman. I know he's not on TV anymore, but I'm still a big fan. If I didn't do these slides, somebody would ask, what were the top 10 statements? So this is a good way to look at some of the things that are strengths today. And we're going to look at it thematically, but I did want to just spend a minute or two on some of these things that stand out as strengths. You'll note that we're at very high positive response, certainly in many cases above that 75% positive that I alluded to. The negative, certainly a handful of these, certainly below the 10%. Item number 5, this is considered a primary driver of engagement in most of the research. Do you understand how what you do impacts the ultimate goal or vision or mission of the institution? Very solid finding there. Relationship alone, let me do just a quick another show of hands. How many folks have had this experience at some point in your professional career? You had a manager or supervisor that you liked, but you didn't think they were a very good manager or supervisor. How many folks have had that experience? Okay, so well over half the room. Good relationship is a nice foundation. Good relationship alone doesn't make for a good manager. But that's one of the things about this community that people value, the relationships they have. So this is a piece that we can build on. We ask a couple of statements about work-life support. One of those is, does your supervisor support it, where the rubber really hits the road, regardless of what the policies are? And we see a resounding positive response on that. Item number 2, this is the item I mentioned that essentially refers to kind of the sense of autonomy, right? The antithesis being micromanaged. One of the nice findings on this item was it not just an overall positive response at 72%, but this was positive pretty much across the board, not just faculty. We generally do see higher responses among faculty regarding academic freedom, but we saw good responses among our staff as well. Item number 61, you'll see an asterisk by it. You won't see the benchmark data. That was an item unique to this survey, this institution, and we're asking essentially about the welcoming environment at the department level. And at 71 and 13, that's a good finding. It's not an isolated finding when we look at some of the other related DEI questions. So let's look at the second half of our top 10. We see item number 25. So again, when the frame of reference is specific, at the department level, we see some good things. Item number 3 is a terrific finding. I think arguably among the most important things a good manager does is make expectations clear. At 70 and 15, we've got a solid finding there. Item 1 is about job fit. Item 36, that sense of pride. And item 15 is a credibility statement as it relates to values. So we've got some good news here, right? We've got some things we can build on. Now let's come at some of that good news from a different angle. So this should start to look familiar. This is the left half of that first slide we saw, which had the strengths and opportunities on the same slide. So I mentioned we were going to kind of dissect these and look at some supporting evidence. So we don't just pull these out of a hat because we think they sound good. So when we look at the job fit, autonomy, and connection to mission, item 2 we talked about, item 5 we saw on our top 10, as was item 36, and item 1 is around job fit. At 65% positive on all 4 of these items, relatively low negative. While they're not necessarily at our Carnegie benchmark, got a pretty good foundation on which to build here, right? So again, about job fit, autonomy, sense of pride, and understanding how what we do makes a difference. The benefits in work-life balance. So make a mental note of item 34. This institution's benefits meet my needs. At 64 and 11, that's pretty good, right? It's not a bad finding by any means. When we look at the compensation item here shortly, you'll see a pretty big gap there. And I'll share with you a couple thoughts on that real quick. Item number 47 we saw, that was the one regarding the supervisor's support of work-life balance. Item 53 gives us insight into the experience of the policies and practices. So we've got a pretty big gap there. The good news is where the rubber hits the road, that our supervisors are trying to support as best they can. All right, which that's a good segue in terms of our supervisor department chair competencies. So we talked about good relationship. We talked about the importance of making expectations clear. 12 is another credibility statement, much like the value statement we saw earlier. 19 has to do with ensuring the experience of a level playing field, consistent and fair treatment. And 20 is an interesting item. We just recently did a research project with an association called the Network for Change and Continuous Innovation in Higher Education. Anybody familiar with that association? Yeah, Sue back there. I don't have enough good things to say about it. It was an offshoot of NJCU. It was some folks in higher ed who were interested in change management and continuous innovation. They got enough critical mass that they actually spun off and started their own association. And it's a great organization. Among the things I like about it is you've got folks from across all different academic and administrative disciplines, if you will, in higher ed, but with a common interest on change management and continuous improvement and innovation. In any case, we did a research project in partnership with them where there were a number of institutions, member institutions of that association have used this instrument, and there were some folks who thought that there might be some items that would potentially be predictive of an institution's ability to foster creativity, to be innovative. We tested 12 items. There were 6 when we did essentially a confirmatory factor analysis that were highly correlated. One of those was item 20. My supervisor, department chair, actively solicited my suggestions and ideas. So if we have a value around innovation or creativity, or if we have a strategic goal or initiative around our ability to be innovative, then this is an item we want to do well on, and you actually do well on this item. In terms of the diversity, equity, inclusion, so mentioned that the item 61 wasn't an isolated finding. We saw that on our top 10. Item number 50, 45, and 54 are 3 of our core statements here. So 50 is about institutional commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. 45 is about welcoming environment, and 54, in many regards, is a risk management question. Do folks know what the processes, procedures are, what the resources are, if they feel like they've been aggrieved in any form or fashion? So, generally we've got some good findings. That's not to say there's not room for improvement on those. I am encouraged that the negative isn't high on those. I'd be much more concerned if we saw high negative on these. And we'll tease that out when we look at some of the statements where we actually see some high negative here momentarily. All right, so those, that's kind of our quick hit list in terms of things that stand out as strengths, good foundations on which to build. I mentioned one of the things that surfaced in this survey, particularly in the verbatim responses, were folks' sense of interest in transparency, right? Is there a sense of transparency? And to give you some evidence of the commitment to transparency, let's go to the next slide. So we talked about the top 10. Let's look at the bottom 10 statements, right? Let's look at the items where you all scored the lowest. And you will note a couple of things, you keen observers. The positives are much lower than what we just saw, and we have some very high negatives. I identified 20 as a threshold. We've got negatives here at 30, 35, 46%. That's significant. So let's tease some of these out here. So this theme of resource constraints, one of the ways it manifests is staffing. And as I mentioned, resource constraints is a challenge that many colleges, probably most colleges and universities, continue to struggle with. And you get a sense of that even as you look at the Carnegie classification benchmark on that. So I'm not mitigating that it is an acute pain point for you all here, and you've got lots of company on that. Item 58, there's a sense that we're all on the same team at this institution. This is another one that at our honor roll institutions, item 58, like item 59, is highly predictive of item 60. This is another one of those, what I'll call differentiating qualities of great workplaces. The sense that we're all on the same team. Now, is that easier to do at a small college than a large public university? Absolutely. And have I seen large public universities with highly unionized workforces that do well on this item? Absolutely. Now, there is, so I think that when there is, and I'm going to tie this to item 58 for a second, when there is a commonly held perception of what's special and unique about your culture, that tends to bring a community together. So given what we saw in item 58, I'm not surprised, or item 59 rather, I'm not surprised at this finding here on item 58. I was teasing a little bit, kind of poking higher ed in the chest as a whole earlier regarding what we do at colleges today to create a culture of appreciation. One of the other areas where baffled seems strong, but I guess I am a little bit baffled sometimes, is how our colleges today struggle with the onboarding process of new faculty and staff, right? And one of the reasons it's somewhat ironic to me is because we do such a good job in our orientation of our new students, our first-year students and our transfer students. And that's not an accident. Those of you who work in student affairs know that the research is pretty substantive regarding the sooner we connect students to each other, to the resources, to faculty, to staff, the more likely they're going to be successful. And as simple as that may sound, most institutions today are less intentional and successful in the onboarding process as it relates to new faculty and staff. I think oftentimes that onboarding is delegated to an HR office to say, hey, get them up to speed, and we expect them to be turnkey when they show up at the desk in our department. And I'm not sure I'm not sure if that's all we're doing, that we're really setting people up to be successful. Now, if I had a room full of CFOs, I might go into even more detail on this, because with a finding like we have on item 30 here, that's costing real dollars, right? If it takes us 6 months to get somebody up and running and we can cut that time in half, there's some potential productivity gains. Or if we're losing faculty and staff because we're not integrating them and integrating them into our welcoming environment, that also is very costly. Orientation and onboarding processes, they're not rocket science. They're almost formulaic. So this is one of those areas that with a concerted effort, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, I suspect you could move the needle in relatively short order on this. The best onboarding and orientation processes I've seen in colleges and universities today generally do three things. There's some component that connects people to the institution's history and culture, right? Whether this is our senior leadership team, this is our shared governance model, this is our history, these are our values, these are key milestones in the history of the institution. So there's a cultural component, an institutional-wide component. There is necessarily and importantly an HR component, right? Benefits, compensation, professional development, the nuts and bolts of what it means to be an employee at this institution. And often overlooked is the onboarding orientation that needs to happen at the department or work group level, right? That's probably the one that's most frequently overlooked. But helping folks understand, this is where the coffee is. This is who gets together for lunch. These are some of our formal and informal norms. So all three, if we hit all three of those, you're likely to set people up for success better. 57 is another barometer statement. And item 67 was again, another custom statement. The leaders of this institution value people as their most important resource. So less than half our population responding positively to that. And I think there's a number of dynamics. You'll have had a lot of transition in your senior leadership and continuing transition, new folks, and that was one of the things we talked about. In my experience, high-performing teams don't happen by accident, whether it's a leadership team or at a cabinet level or any type of team, frankly. And I think your senior leadership team, your cabinet, is in some of those early stages of coming together. So this data, I suspect, I know, will be an important tool as they do some of that work. All right, let's look at the second half of our bottom 10. In much the same fashion that I think it's critical for supervisors to make expectations clear, one of the most important things our senior leaders do is provide clear direction for this institution's future. We've got a low positive on this and a pretty high negative as well. 37 is related to the item we just saw a minute ago in terms of the belief that senior leadership cares about us. And this was also a theme, I won't call it pervasive, but it was a pretty substantive theme in the verbatim responses, the responses to the open-ended questions. Those two open-ended questions, the first we asked through an appreciative inquiry lens, what do you appreciate most about working at this institution? In response to that, we saw a lot of comments, as I alluded to already, about the sense of pride, the sense of community, the impact and interaction with students. Those were the most common items in response to that question. The second of the two open-ended questions is more of a solution-oriented question. What would make this a better place to work? And in response to that question, we saw a number of items that spoke to this sense of connection to senior leadership, communication from senior leadership, and a greater sense that senior leadership actually cares about us as individuals, right? Doesn't see us as just cogs in the machine that is this university. We talked about performance management earlier and fairness. Item 16, we're going to revisit that here shortly when we do an opportunities analysis here. 43 gives us some insight into the quality of dialogue, the quality of communication. So it is clear folks want more communication from and with senior leadership, and that doesn't just mean more emails, right? And if I were to say that's the only thing that surfaced in terms of people's interest in more communication, I would not be painting the complete picture. Right? So this item 43 has nothing to do with senior leadership communication necessarily. It has to do with the quality of our dialogue. Can we discuss and debate issues respectfully without it getting personal? Right? And 55, yet another communication item, regular and open communication among faculty, administration, and staff. I think shared communication, like shared governance, it's easy to talk about in the abstract, right? But it's one of those things that's simple but not easy. Right? At lots of institutions I see, they have all sorts of tools for communicating, right? We've got electronic news bulletins, we've got monthly emails, we've got hard copy newspapers, we have posters in the wall, and then they get frustrated when folks say there's not good communication. And, I'm poking fun a little bit. Those can all be good vehicles for sharing information, but as probably every one of us knows here, good communication isn't just information sharing, right? So if we were in a communications 101 class, we could draw a very complex model where we have a sender and a receiver and a message that's encoded and has to be sent and decoded and confirmed for understanding. And then that's happening in a box where there's all sorts of external noise that complicates the effectiveness of that message. And we haven't even begun to talk about the relationships involved and the dynamics involved that impact that. So good communication is much more than just pushing information out. There's a time and place for that, but if we truly want a culture of dialogue, a culture of communication, we've got to to do more than just share information. All right, let's look at our opportunities. So we looked at the strength side of the ledger. Now we're going to look at the opportunity side of the ledger, the weaknesses, the challenges, call them what you will. And again, these should look familiar, and we're going to unpack them a little bit here. So I mentioned there were a number of issues that essentially inform this theme of resource constraints. So number 4 is a large framed question. I provided the resources I need to be effective in my job. 28 we saw earlier regarding staffing. 31 is about facilities, and 11 about compensation. So I should make a mental note of the benefits item where we're at 64% positive. When I see a significant gap between those items, oftentimes one of the dynamics in play is that people don't understand either the compensation philosophy of the university or the compensation system itself. So one of the things that we're starting to see more and more at colleges and universities, and allow me latitude, I get colleges and universities are unique institutions, right? So I'm not trying to corporatize any campus these days, but that's not to say there aren't things that we can learn from other industries, other organizations. One of the things we're starting to see more of are essentially processes and documentation around total compensation that help faculty and staff understand the compensation system, the compensation philosophy, and the real dollar value of some of the benefits other than what shows up in the automatic deposit or the paycheck. Okay, performance management and accountability. Also, number of kind of different pieces contributing to that. So one of those, and this is among the most difficult things to do well, is good performance management process, a review process. We all think we're probably performing better than others think we were performing, right? That's just a function of human nature in some regards. But at the end of the day, is there a sense that the review process is effective? That's what we're trying to get at in item 7. Less than half our population responding, fully almost a quarter saying no, that's certainly not the case. We talked about the onboarding process, so we won't belabor that at this point. Item 18 and 16. In some regards, they're tangentially related, though they are different items. But a theme that threads through both of those is our ability, both individually, particularly those of us who are in supervisory, managerial, or leadership roles, and institutionally to have difficult conversations, right? So if I were just to unpack item 18 for a second, issues of low performance are addressed in my department. If I am a department chair or a manager, and I'm not comfortable with difficult conversations, it may be difficult for me to have a conversation with somebody who's not performing to standard, right? Or whose behavior isn't congruent with who we say we are. So in that kind of scenario, as that department chair or manager who's not comfortable with those conversations, what am I likely to do? Ignore it, or just stumble through it as quickly as I can. And in most cases, when I do that, conversation doesn't go as well as it needs. So when I see items like this, I would wonder, in that spirit of curiosity, and actually, in hindsight, I should have shared this. As you all roll up your sleeves and get into this data, I'll encourage you to do three things. Come from a place of inquiry, right? Be curious. What does this data mean? What are the implications? How can we use it to help us, right? And that goes hand in hand with our world in academia, exploring, right? Being curious. So I'll encourage you to be curious. I'll also encourage you to be solution-oriented. These results are what they are, and there's not a whole lot of benefit, frankly, in digging up all the grievances of the past, and to the extent we can learn from those, great. But you are where you are right now. What are you doing moving forward? So the solution-oriented mindset, I think, serves you well. The other, my unsolicited coaching here that I would invoke, particularly in this scenario, I was chatting with your provost here earlier that in higher ed, there are all sorts of dynamic tensions, right? It's part of the way we're structured. There's tensions between boards and leadership, right? There's tensions between administration and faculty. Sometimes there's tensions between faculty and staff. There's tensions between unionized workforce and administration, all sorts of dynamic tensions. And when working with this data and when working on things not related to this, I think you all are well served by coming from a place of partnership. Be curious, be solution-oriented, and be a partnership mindset. And this goes back to the item we talked about earlier, item number 58. There's a sense that we're all in it on the same team together, right? There's a sense that we're all in it together. So no question, we all do have our particular lenses that we look at, our particular portfolios we're responsible. And at the end of the day, your individual success is going to be largely dependent on the success of your colleagues. So back to curiosity. Item 16 and 18 on this slide here. I identified supervisory competencies earlier as a strength, And I will stand by that. It is a relative strength in this data set. And I would wonder today about the consistency and the effectiveness of those in supervisory roles on the academic or administrative of the House with the tough conversations. The tough conversations like the one I just kind of almost pseudo role played there, right? Having to tell somebody their performance isn't up to standard or they're not getting the promotion that they thought they deserved. Okay, let's look at performance management and accountability through another lens. So here we've got a handful of the custom statements. So item 64, willing to confront difficult and sensitive issues. So less than half our population. So that's related to our fluency with these tough conversations. Item 16, I am confident that concern about disrespect or unfair treatment will be handled appropriately. So certainly related, but also has to do, in some regards, I would suggest this is also kind of a risk management question, right? We want to make sure that folks have a sense of confidence in the processes, the resources, the people who are there to ensure that. A little bit better finding when we ask about disrespectful student behavior, whether we address that. Still not necessarily anything to hang our hat on, but a little bit better finding on that. Respect and appreciation. I bet most folks here are familiar with Gallup. In some, they do lots of polling. A lot of folks know about their political polling. They're also pretty heavy in the engagement space in the corporate sector. They've got a survey, a 12-item survey that's essentially got to, through a meta-analysis, looking at a bunch of surveys, and they identified 12 statements they thought were most predictive of an engaged workforce. One, they've got a respect question that says, I've been recognized in the last 7 days, right? They actually put a day on it. I don't think, and I'm not alone in thinking that that's probably a little bit much to say that you've got to be regularly, authentically recognized every 7 days, but there is great value in folks feeling like they're acknowledged, right? And not just having to wait for those years of service awards. Here again, I would wonder about, in that spirit of curiosity, I would wonder about today whether those who are in leadership, supervisory, and manager roles, are we as good about catching people doing things right and acknowledging and celebrating that as we are about slapping them on the wrist when they come up short, right? Or are we preparing and training that those who are in supervisory roles, that, hey, if you're a supervisor at this university, part of your job is to create a culture of respect in your team or department. That goes with the job description of being a manager of people, right? So item 9, that's really where kind of the rubber hits the road, much like we talked about with the work-life balance statements. We had one around the supervisory, then we had another, or the supervisory experience, we had another item regarding policies and practices. Similarly, item 9 is about that dynamic that typically plays out between an employee and their immediate supervisor, whereas item 34 is more systemic about recognitions and awards programs. 52, a little bit better item in terms of celebrating important milestones. And 65 was yet another custom statement. Do we celebrate each other's successes and accomplishments as much as their own? Yeah. So room for improvement on all of those. We have a couple more regarding this respect and appreciation theme. Again, these ones with asterisks are the custom items. So 62 is another version of a welcoming environment. We've got a pretty good finding at 64 and 20 on that. Feeling like a valued member of the community, that sense of belonging at 48 and 24, less than half our population. I'll tie that also back to the perception of a special and unique culture. When there is that commonly held perception of a special and unique culture, generally not only does it bring a community together, but people feel a greater sense of connection to and or belonging. 37, senior leadership shows a genuine interest in the well-being of faculty, administration, and staff. There's a quote from a former business titan on leadership, said that essentially employees don't care what senior leaders think until they know that you care. They don't care what you think until they know that you care. And I think this is a conversation we had at the cabinet level. How is it we can convey a greater sense of our personal commitment to individual and employees and the health of this culture. So 67 we saw earlier, 68, another one of those dynamic tensions, faculty value the contributions of staff, 58 and 15. That's actually not a bad finding. It's not to say there's not room for improvement, but I've seen lots of institutions where the tension between faculty and staff is much more significant than what you all have here today. In some regards, it's almost like a caste system in terms of how people's contributions are valued. All right, so let's look at the communication and collaboration because they're related, right? One informs the other. And as I mentioned here, it's not just about communication from and with senior leadership. Item number 8, when I offer a new idea, I believe it will be fully considered. Note the wording. We're not saying you believe it's going to be implemented. It's just your sense that it's going to get a fair hearing, that it's actually going to be listened to. At 48 and 22, clearly room for improvement for that. Item 21, frame of reference is very specific. In my department, we communicate openly about issues that impact each other's work at 60 and 18. Item number 22, changes that affect me are discussed prior to being implemented. This is one of the things that I think is, in some regards, most corrosive or erosive on culture. When faculty and staff read about things that are happening at their college or university in the newspaper or hear about it via the rumor mill versus hearing about it through internal resources and processes. So that gives us some insight there. 43, again, gives us insight into the quality of the dialogue, right? And 68, we asked a very specific question about being talked over and a little bit better finding on that, though again, room for improvement. Let's look at our collaboration statements here. So 13 and 23, the frame of reference is very specific in terms of the department. 26, we're expanding that frame. 58, we saw earlier on our low scoring items. I can count on people to cooperate across departments. Less than half our population, almost 20% saying no. And again, that sense that we're all on the same team. So kind of supportive of those. All right, let's talk about shared governance. So item 38 is the first one I'll direct your attention to. And again, the wording here is very specific. We're not asking, is your shared governance model effective? We're simply asking, is the role of faculty in shared governance, is it clearly stated and publicized? Do people understand what the role of faculty is in your shared governance model? That's one part of your shared governance model. As I mentioned, there's lots of different models out there as it regards to shared governance. And if people don't know what your shared governance model is, then there's all sorts of opportunity for there to be confusion around who owns the decision and what the decision-making process is. So one of the things that we're starting to see more of regarding shared governance, and not isolated to shared governance, but our institutions being very thoughtful around helping people understand where the decision-making authority lies. Is this a board decision? Is this a presidential decision? Is this a cabinet decision? Is this a decision that's delegated to another governing body, a faculty senate, a staff council, or something to that effect? So who owns the decision? Similarly, what's the decision-making process, right? Is this a presidential fiat? Is this a consensus decision? Is this a majority rule decision? So there may be some merit as you all look at, using this data to see if we can't better articulate and better educate folks as to what our shared governance model is so people have a really accurate understanding of what those processes are and particularly what the collaborative, where those opportunities are for collaboration. Better finding on item 39 where we ask about faculty involvement as it relates to the education program. When we expand the reference on 42 in terms of institutional planning at 38 and 29, notable essentially gap between that and item 39, 46 and 55 coming at from another angle in terms of working together and again the communication component. All right, so let's talk about senior leadership. So senior leadership, as we talked about, among the most important things to do, provide clear direction, right? So that has to do with strategic plan. We'll talk potentially about that in the Q&A section that we'll segue to here momentarily. Articulating a clear vision is important, as is the day-to-day communication, which is some of what we're asking about in item 41. Senior leadership communicates openly about important matters. We have a better finding as it relates to the confidence in essentially the capabilities of senior leadership on item 32, and as well as the values. 56 is a credibility statement in terms of do we believe what we're told by senior leadership. Now, a couple thoughts on this real quick. I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I have seen either a senior leadership team, a cabinet or executive committee, or individual members of a senior leadership team operate with real bad intent as it regards to their credibility. I don't see that often. But oftentimes I see senior leadership their credibility gets undermined or compromised by a couple of things. One is mixed messages, right? When we say things, but people see our behavior not necessarily following through or being congruent with that. So if we're sending mixed messages, that can undermine credibility. Another is unintended promises. We may say things as senior leaders about where we're going or what our intentions are, and people hear it as a commitment or promise, that we didn't necessarily intend, so then we get that held against. So as senior leaders, I think it's really important, and this counsel is appropriate, I think, for anybody in a leadership role, being very thoughtful around making sure you're not sending mixed messages and that you're very intentional about the commitments that you make. One of the best examples of a mixed message I saw, I had occasion to work with years ago with a consumer products manufacturer. They make things like shampoo and makeup and that kind of thing. And they had a big facility down in North Carolina, about 3,000 employees at this facility. And we were supporting them in some work on a culture transformation project. And what they were trying to do was empower, particularly the folks on these manufacturing lines, that when they saw defects, that they would speak up and stop the run so they didn't have error on top of error and compromised product on top of compromised product, which was a very different way of being for this organization historically. And as I was getting a tour of the facility, I was in the cafeteria, which was a nice cafeteria, and in the corner of the cafeteria, they had a television on one of those push stands, the remote push stands, so they could wheel it around. And there was an 8-minute video on loop, which had the plant manager and the president of the company talking about this culture transformation. It was professionally done. It was pretty inspirational. I thought, okay, that's good stuff. And then as I looked closer, I saw a sign on the cart that said this in all capital letters, black magic marker: "Don't touch the television!" Exclamation point, exclamation, exclamation point. And it was signed, "The Management," right? Now, I get there are very good and legitimate reasons for folks not wanting employees to turn to ESPN or CNN or Fox or whatever channel they wanted to watch. And I will also suggest there were 100 different ways of getting that message across. I will promise you, and I can promise you, that the plant manager and the CEO had nothing to do with the sign, and that very compelling message about empowerment was significantly compromised by that heavy-handed message, "Don't touch the channel or the television." So that's kind of a colorful example of a mixed message, but they can happen even across different levels of leadership. I'll throw one other thing into the mix that if I were a betting man, I would bet this is going on at this institution today. In that there is, so I may be, again, let's say I'm a department chair or a supervisor or manager of a group, and there may be news that I now have to share with you all coming from the cabinet that I know my team is not going to like, right? Maybe it's about benefit, maybe it's about resource that we're not getting, or the timing of a decision that we're looking for. And in this example, because I'm the manager who I role-played earlier, where I'm not good with difficult conversations, I may say things like this. I might pull my team together and say, "Hey folks, I got some news I'm going to share with you. I know we thought we were going to get those resources that we had talked about and that we were budgeting, and I was hoping to hear today, and in fact I did hear, and it's not going to be news you're going to like, but the president and the cabinet say that we can't do that. We can't do it now, we can't do it in the next 12 months. If it were my decision, we'd do it differently, but I'm just doing what the folks upstairs tell me to do," right? So I will guarantee you that based on what I see in these survey results, that's a dynamic that's playing out here. And there may be no malicious intent, right? I'm simply, in this case, this kind of hypothetical, I'm trying to deliver bad news in a way that mitigates the damage to my team, right? So my intention may be benevolent, but the impact is not necessarily one that's giving my team a sense of aligned leadership. In fact, I'm doing quite the opposite. I'm throwing senior leadership under the bus, right? So I share this to say, not that there's not real work for your senior leadership team to do, and I think they're inspired to do some of that work. And if we want to see better results on all these statements, then collectively we need to own them all as a community, faculty and staff both. Okay, so let's talk about some next steps here. So earlier I shared with you that we've deployed the survey. We're now in the communication phase, communicating the results. So we're socializing the data. We're disseminating the results. And kind of next steps is action planning, right? It would be hard for us, even as a small group here today, to try and action plan the same day that we're absorbing survey data. So there generally is a little bit of a break there. So the intention is to create some task force, right? And that's a work in progress. We'll potentially have we're going to switch to some Q&A here momentarily, so you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. I think one of the other pieces I want to speak to proactively is, one of the questions that I'm sure would come up is, well, when are we going to do this again, right? It's a fair question. It's a good question. It's essentially 5 years since you did your last survey. So higher ed, and I know I'm not sharing anything that you don't already know, that change tends to happen slower in higher ed than any other industries and sectors. Right? So whereas in the private sector, or the private corporate space, lots of organizations do surveys like this on an annual basis, it is rare that we would recommend an annual survey like this at a college or university. It's not unheard of, but it's rare. Most colleges and universities kind of your ilk would be on a 2 or 3 year survey cycle. I think 3 years is too far for you all right now, particularly given some of the leadership transition. 1 year's not enough, so probably 2 years. That's not a decision that's been made yet, but that's probably where I would lead you all on that. But that's a fair question. And if this is going to have real impact, it can't just be perceived as a one and done thing. So that's to the extent that we're looking for evidence that senior leadership is really committed to this, I'll encourage you to look for data points that suggest they are, right? We've got a number of our cabinet here today, right? That's a piece of evidence. We're going to do this survey again. That's a piece of evidence. The task force, that's how those are set up and what that process looks, potentially more evidence. So I'll encourage you to look for those pieces of evidence that this is really being taken at a significant level. So that's high-level next steps. I want to share one other thing real quick before I open up for communication and create some space for your president and or Sue or Natalie, who have been shepherding this process. I mentioned that I would share with you some high-level recommendations. So, at the outset, I said this was a communication tool, right? In addition to being an assessment tool, it's important to communicate the results to the community. This is the next step in that process. Number of potential linkages here, strategic planning, accreditation self-study, any of those connections that we can make, it helps reinforce so that people see, rather than seeing those as one-off initiatives, they see them connected in the kind of holistic way that they are. A very specific recommendation regarding senior leadership that I shared with your cabinet is we got to figure out a way to connect folks to senior leadership better, right? And one of the ways that we can do that is about visibility, interaction, and relationship. The more visible our senior leaders are, the more opportunities for interaction. More opportunities are for interaction, the more opportunities to build relationship. And when there are strained relationships or tensions, it's good to have a solid relationship on which to fall back on, right? Do we come from a place of assuming best intentions or assuming bad intent, right? When we have strong relationship, we're more likely to give each other the benefit of the doubt and come to the conversation in a spirit of partnership. The communication, I think we saw enough, there's enough evidence here that there's some fundamental opportunities regarding how we create more of a culture of communication, more of a culture of dialogue, that we're not just talking at each other, but we're talking to and with each other and coming from a place of inquiry and dialogue as a place of heavy-handed telling. And regarding performance management and accountability, I think given what we saw on item 16, item 18, and the review process item, that it's probably worth looking at some of the structure, some of the processes regarding performance management and regarding those pieces that theoretically are in play to help us have a culture of accountability. Okay, so we're going to make the deck available to you. So anything that you've seen here, you're going to have an opportunity to see. We're simulcasting as well, and we're going to do this again this afternoon. So the intention is to be as transparent as we can with the survey data. We may not have all the answers in terms of what the specific next steps are or the top 3 things we're going to focus on, but I think that's a collaborative process for the community to engage. Okay, so let me open it up for questions and or comments. Questions and or comments. It's all fair play. Yes, sir.
Robert Krause, Music, Dance, and Theater. I want to thank you for presenting this amazing information. You obviously have put together a tremendous amount of data and hit a lot of points to the institution. As I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, in some cases, would it be helpful to break it down into some of the smaller response groups? For example, there was a question, a couple of examples, I'm not sure if they're appropriate examples, but one example would be a question about the appreciation of the contribution of staff by faculty. And I'm thinking, well, maybe the faculty think they're being very appreciated, and the staff think they're not.
Yeah.
Is there a way to break that down? Or the fact that we have a few colleges and that maybe some of the responses about communications, leadership, may be skewed by the results in one or another of those groups. Is there a way to break it down to identify where the opportunities truly exist rather than calling them university-wide opportunities?
Great. And for the benefit of those folks who are either dialing in and or watching this remotely, let me rephrase the question. And I'll gloss over all the nice things he said about the presentation and me in the first place. The question was, do we have the ability as an institution to disaggregate this data set in structural ways, whether it be by college and or department, so that we can see more specifically where some of these areas are most acute? And the short answer is yes, we do have that. Now, a couple mechanical pieces here. One of the things, and it wasn't a major issue with you all, but when we're doing surveys in what we would consider a low trust environment, oftentimes people have a lot of concern around providing any self-identifying information. We didn't get a lot of calls in our help desk from you all saying, oh my gosh, is this going to be tracked back to me? But we do make a pretty substantive commitment to protecting the anonymity of respondents and the confidentiality of their individual responses. So we only report data out in subsets where we have a minimum of 5 respondents. So if you're in a subset, whether it be a department or division or any of these demographic groups, and there are 5 respondents, at least 5 or more respondents, then we have the potential to be able to do that. But first and foremost, we want to make sure we're not doing any harm or doing anything that's going to make folks uncomfortable and that would potentially undermine strong response rates in future surveys. It's a great question. Thank you, sir. Other questions? I am going to ask you to indulge me in a quick exercise here. And you don't have to get out of your chairs or do anything here. But you all have had a lot of change, and I suspect there will be more change going forward, right? And this survey data could be the impetus for some of that change. So indulge me for a second, and next, what I'll ask you to do is look at how you have your arms crossed. So for me, I have my left hand open on my right bicep. My right hand is in a fist underneath my left bicep. So look at how you've got your arms crossed. Now, for some of you, what we do next could be the most difficult thing you do today, right? What I'm going to ask you to do is go ahead and cross your arms the exact opposite way, right? Go ahead. Okay. I know it's tough. Some of you need another cup of coffee. I get it. All right. Now go ahead and shake it out. I know. Tell me what was that experience like?
Uncomfortable.
It was uncomfortable. What else? Challenging? You had to think about it? Yeah, so let's just stay with those 3. You had to think about it, right? It wasn't easy. It required a little mental effort. You had to think about it. It was challenging. Even as you were thinking about it, it was challenging. It was uncomfortable, right? And I'm not going to point fingers, but there are a handful of you, more than one in here, who did what once you got it the exact opposite way? Went right back to what was comfortable, right? Right? And as simple as that exercise is, it's a great metaphor for change, right? We have to think about it. It's uncomfortable. It can be challenging, and there's a tendency to want to go back to what's comfortable. So as you think about using this survey data to continue the good work that you all are doing and embrace and make some of those changes that necessarily we may need to do, so see some improvement in subsequent surveys, know that that's part of the process. To the extent that it requires effort, it's challenging, it's uncomfortable, there's a tendency to go back to what's comfortable, know that that just goes with the territory. Another question and or comment?
Yeah, so I think that you did a great job in offering potential avenues at improving or changes in the scores. But I wonder if it's possible in the future you highlight 4 indicators to you that are ostensibly a challenge for the institution, and maybe identify other institutions that do that well.
Yeah.
And relay what mechanisms or what it is they do that likely contribute to that higher score there, that maybe might influence us in giving us some ideas of how to pursue change.
Yeah. And so the question was, in either additional work that we may or may not do with you all or future surveys, is there the potential for us to either more specifically tell you, hey, work on this, and potentially may even make some introductions to institutions that are doing that well. And we're happy to do that. So I've been working with Sue and Natalie, and they've been working with colleagues of mine back at the office. So we've deployed the survey, we've got the results, we've provided you with the data. To the extent that we can support some of your next steps, we'll happily do that. Regarding, I know you mentioned the STARS program, one of the universities that I think has done some pretty good work on recognition awards is not too far from here, Pace University. They've got a pretty cool program called Your Excellence Shows, acronym YES, that may sound a little hokey, but it's actually pretty well utilized. They've done some good things with that. But yeah, happy to make other introductions as well, or connections to institutions. University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley is doing some pretty good work in terms of their faculty onboarding and their orientation down there. That was a combination of two University of Texas colleges. About 5 years ago, they merged Edinburgh and Brownsville to now that's University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. But with their faculty onboarding, they're doing some pretty good stuff. It's certainly in the College of Engineering. I'm not sure it's transferred all the way across the university, but there's pockets of excellence there, as there are here, I'm sure. Other questions, comments, or thoughts? Care to close us out?
So let me ask you a question. We know we need these task forces, and I know that you've done this across the country and other places. How about some ideas about how would you think that these ought to be formed?
Yeah. So composition of task force. It's a good question. So I've seen a couple of different ways. Now, and I'm going to back into my answer on this, is typically, there are going to be some areas, some action areas that are systemic, that warrant focus across the university, right? And there's probably a handful of those that are worth focusing on, right? Orientation, some of the performance management. I'm not sure we need a task force for the senior leadership items, but I think your cabinet has heard that, and I think you can hold them accountable, and I think they're eager to provide a different experience. So there's typically institution-wide action items, but then also there's action planning that can happen at the major academic or administrative unit. And to your question earlier, can we look at some of that data by some of those areas? Because there may be something in your world that's unique to you all, right? So that in your college or your division or your department, you may say as a group, hey, we need to focus on this, right? It may be the quality of our dialogue and being respectful and just the level of civility with which we engage. So we want to leave latitude and encourage that kind of action planning at that more granular level, if you will, whether that's major academic and administrative unit and or department, if we drill down that high. So task forces generally are tackling the systemic issues, right? And in terms of composition, I think, we want to model the very things that surfaced in the survey, right? So people want more participation, they want more collaboration, they want to feel a sense of being included and respected. That's not isolated to faculty, so I think you're well served by having faculty and staff both on these task force, as well as representation across some of the significant administrative and academic units. We obviously don't want to get into analysis paralysis or have a 30-member task force that isn't able to get anything done. But I think in terms of task force, representation is important. Having multiple areas, disciplines, roles represented is important. It's also, and I'm not sure what's going to be the best way here, we want to expand our pool of members from just the typical folks who would either volunteer on these. So, in many cases, I think it's strategic to make sure that we're including folks who may not self-select in, right? So potentially creating opportunities for volunteers, but also asking individuals. I think on those task force, one of the other things that I've seen some institutions do well and intentionally is make sure that they have folks not just with positional authority, but they're also tapping into those informal leaders, right? And you all know who there are. There are folks who may not necessarily have a department chair or a manager label, but people look to them and they provide influence. So tapping into both formal and informal leaders on those task force can help give them credence and ability. I think the other piece that's really important is being very specific around what the charge of the task force is, right? So back to the decision making, right? We don't want to create a task force and the task force think that, oh yeah, whatever we say goes, if that's not what we're setting up. So being very specific in the charge and where the ultimate decisions will be made, I think is also something to consider. Yeah, and we'll, as I say, we'll continue to be resources. We're not going anywhere. I'll be going home this afternoon, but in the big picture, we're not going anywhere. We'll support you as it makes sense. Great. Yep.
Well, I want to thank you all so much. He had a chance, he shared it to us, I guess about a month ago, and then we shared it to the senior team. And the senior team, I think I told the Senate yesterday that I threatened to take them camping. They don't like camping, so we're going to go away for a couple of days because we all need to learn to work better together. I need to learn to communicate better, and so my goal this year is that you can hold the senior team accountable for their capacity to be working together seamlessly, but most importantly, that they are inclusive and how they think about bringing everybody along. We are doing so many good things here at the institution, and it's starting to show. I don't know if you had a chance to see New Jersey Monthly. They did a report on the top institutions in the state of K-12 schools, and McNair, as it usually does, came out top. As a matter of fact, it's one of the top in the nation. You open up the article, and there's a full-page picture of a student who's graduating from McNair and going to college, and she had an NJCU t-shirt on. And that is because of our honors program. And lots of you have been involved in the evolution of that program. So you have so much to be proud of that we're working on. What I'd like to do is to find out the places where we can all work together to be better. I think that communication and respect and civility are critical to it. And then, again, I'm going to do my piece and hold the senior team accountable and myself accountable. You're going to see me a lot more on campus. I'm already out there some, anyway, but I'll even do more because I think that's important. But I think they need to be out also listening. So I want to thank you for your work and sign up for the task forces. Thank you. Please make sure if you have, if you have any questions, make sure you email Richard. He's been fantastic. He's really good at telling you, okay, I've seen this happen, and this is what I suggest you do. So anyway, this is not uncommon for an institution in change, but the idea now, I think, is we were actually going to do this survey next spring, but I think you're suggesting wait a year? Probably. Okay. We'll wait a year. and then do it again, because I want to see if we can't be much more mindful about this stuff. But thank you. So.